Hi everyone, welcome back to class. I hope your spring break was good and you might be watching this during the week that I'm suggesting or some other time. I think we have a little bit more flexibility with our online schedules. But anyway, let's hop right into it. If we were meeting in class and in person, this prompt would have been on the screen to remind you where we left off before spring break. We were talking about the relationship between plants and the environment. So if you remember, we talked about of dispersal and how seeds move around the landscape. Seeds or spores or anything, any living thing has to disperse its progeny. So, and we were also talking about hydrochory. And so I wanted to remind you of that with this prompt and then transition into what we're talking about today. So cottonwood seedlings are ready to germinate, if you remember, as river flooding recedes, goes down. So what is the implication of this? What happens as our climate warms and flooding occurs earlier? You might imagine that if flooding occurs earlier, it's going to take some time for those cottonwoods, those new cottonwoods, the next generation of cottonwoods to grow up and kind of adapt to this change in flooding. So there will be some asynchrony between the flood recession and that the seedling emergence. And it's interesting to think about, I encourage you to do so, about other examples of plant-animal adaptations that are linked to specific components of the natural world. Of course, it's no surprise, it's nothing new that plants and animals and everything living are adapted to the natural world, but specifically in terms of disturbance and succession, it's interesting to think about how we might group these species together that have similar strategies. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about life history and successional change, and we're really going to focus on plants as much of this class does. So here's our quick outline. I'm going to separate this lecture into two different presentations, just so that you can watch one and go about your life and come back when it's conducive to you. But we'll go through life history models, something called resource congruence and capacitance. And then we'll think about the allocation of captured resources, how plants respond to multiple resources, and end thinking about something called a phytocentric view of succession. But we'll focus on, for this first video, we'll focus on life history models and resource congruence and capacitance. So this whole lecture and the following is going to focus on life history. And life history is an organism's lifetime pattern of growth, differentiation, storage, and reproduction. It's basically how it goes about doing everything that it does. And we can group them into different strategies. So a plant strategy is the patterns of response to the various elements of the environment that are likely to be encountered in the plant's habitat. So that's its strategy, different patterns of how it responds. Now, this term is used to group species into different groups or functional types or guilds. We talked about bird guilds in class. And several attempts have been made to identify life history trends in plants and fit them into overall, over-encompassing general theories about life history evolution. An example, as you can see on the screen here, was proposed by MacArthur and Wilson back in the 60s, and that's the R and K strategist. You might remember this from high school biology. Maybe you took that. So the R strategists often occupy disturbed habitats, but they're really unable to persist. They're short-lived, they're often smaller, their populations grow rapidly, and are mostly regulated by density. In the animal world, we often think of mice as this R strategist. In the grass world, you might think of weedy species, maybe some grasses, things that occupy a disturbed site very quickly. Compared then to a K strategist. These persist in the same habitat for a long, long time. They persist near their carrying capacity, and so they're more regulated, their populations are more regulated by competition and availability of resources. These in the animal world often are talked about as the elephants, the K strategists being elephants, but in the plant world, we might think of trees. A different classification allows species to have a combination of strategies in the evolution of its life history. So this was proposed by Grimes in 1977, and he helpfully used some of the same letters, right? So we have R selection. He calls them rudderals, which is low stress but high disturbance. So these R selection species have short lifespans and high seed production, and they evolved in severely disturbed but potentially productive habitats. And we can compare that then to C selection, which are the competitors. This is also low stress, but low disturbance. So these are highly competitive species. They depend on maximizing resource capture. So they're very quick at capturing all these resources. And they exist because competition is what they are adapted for. They exist in relatively undisturbed habitats. And Grimes' third is S selection, and he calls them stress tolerators. So this is high stress and often low disturbance. So this has reduced vegetative and reproductive vigor and is adapted to endurance in low production environments. Maybe think of a desert compared to a rainforest. And our last one that we'll talk about is proposed by scientist David Tillman, and he talked about resource ratios, how competing species experience these trade-offs in their resource requirements, such that a superior competitor for one resource is an inferior competitor for another. So one species is really good at capturing some resource, but really crummy at capturing another, whereas a different species might be really good at capturing that original species resource that it wasn't very good at, but not very competent at successfully getting that resource that the first species was really competent at. So then succession in Tillman's mind can be explained by a species' trade-offs as these resources change during succession. And because of this, it's really important then to understand that environments vary in time and space. How often have you heard me talk about this? Heterogeneity through time, heterogeneity through space. The environment is constantly changing. So if a species has to make a trade-off, I'm really good at capturing this resource and really poor at capturing another, that means that species is probably very competitive under kind of a limited set of environmental conditions. And once those environmental conditions change, a different species that has made a different set of trade-offs in its evolutionary path will emerge as the new dominant. So this resource availability is really scale dependent, and the required resources do not become simultaneously available in optimal quantities. So one limiting factor might become really available, but it doesn't mean that all of them suddenly become available following a disturbance and after time. So resource congruence refers to that simultaneous availability of resources in both time and space. And these are specifically thought of as the major resources needed by an individual. So for plants, we often fertilize our lawns and our crops, right? Because plants need nitrogen and plants need phosphorus, and plants need potassium and all of these things. And so we want to make sure that they have their dominant resources. And this resource congruence, when resources occur at the same time, is a really crucial component of the environment. And its patterns when these resources are available at the same time in various habitats influence the evolution of these plant strategies. So in environments where resource congruence often occurs, a plant is probably really good at maximizing all the resources kind of to the same degree, which means it's not particularly amazing at capturing resources of any one thing, but really good at capturing lots of different resources at the same time. Whereas other environments that have wildly fluctuating resources and lack resource congruence would have a different set of life history traits by their species that are able to quickly change or maximize their capture of that particular resource. So in thinking about Fort Collins, right, some of the species that exist in Fort Collins has an average annual precipitation of 394 millimeters. It's like 14 inches, something like that. But it has an average annual evaporation of 1,000 millimeters. So what does this mean? It means that plants here are really water limited. There's more evaporation than there is precipitation. So the plants that exist here have to be able to maximize their use of the water when that water is available. And when is that? Of course, there's as we think about this resource congruence, the resource congruence here, the resource is water, and the congruence is not actually happening, right? So when it's raining and when the plants actually need the water later on in the summer, there's this disconnect, this lack of congruence at times for particular species. So the species that exist in Fort Collins and have been adapted to life in Fort Collins have been able to maximize their reproductive growth when that water is available. And this leads to this short grass steppe ecosystem where these grasses grow really, really quickly early on in the spring, but then later on in the summer when evaporation is high, those grasses die off and they've already set seed and they're good to go. So that's resource congruence, utilizing those resources when those resources are available. And let's contrast that then with resource capacitance. So resource capacitance is the ability of an organism to acquire a resource when it's available, but then keep it until it's needed. So we could think about this as a cactus in a desert. It is going to absorb as much water as it can when it rains, but then it'll use that water slowly later on as it needs it. Additionally, there's a really neat something cacti are really, they have a particular photosynthetic pathway called CAM photosynthesis, where they open their stomates, those little holes in the leaves, they open their stomates at night. They let in the carbon dioxide at night, they fix that carbon dioxide, but then during the day, they use that fixed carbon dioxide to make their sugars. Most plants need the carbon dioxide to come in when the light is shining, that sort of resource congruence. But cacti are able to have this resource capacitance where they accept their carbon dioxide at night, but then close their stomates to limit water loss and use that carbon dioxide during the day. And this capacitance is quite an effective strategy in environments where this resource supply is unpredictable or limiting overall. All right, so in the next video, this is the end of this video, we're going to talk about allocation of captured resources, how plants respond to multiple resources, and this phytocentric view of succession. But I've been talking for about 12 minutes, so if you want to come back and watch the next video right now, more power to you. Get up and stretch, get a drink of water, but also feel free to come back some other time and watch the second video.